3PNR with Adam R. Welcome to 3PNR. I'm your host, Adam R. And joining me again is my true crime panel. Everybody introduce yourself. Start with Leslie and work your way to the right.
I'm Leslie Ghiglieri. I'm a true crime author. I spent 12 years in law enforcement and published a true crime book last spring.
My name is Jason White. I'm a homicide detective in the city of Tulsa. I've been a homicide detective for years. Previous to that, I've also worked in an array of other specialty assignments as well. I've been a police officer here for 25 years. You're up, Sandy.
Okay. I'm Sandy Martinez. I am a psychologist, and I have been working in the Florida Department of Corrections for the past 18 years with inmates from minimal custody all the way through death row.
Okay, well, this subject tonight, whatever it is for anyone, is JonBenet Ramsey. It's an unsolved homicide from 1996 of Christmas Day. It has tremendous amount of information. The amount of suspects that are on this list are also tremendous. You have a retired FBI agent. He's on this particular episode he worked it, and that's Agent Clark. I got to tell you, it's an overwhelming amount of information to take in. The suspect listed itself. I mean, there's not a bad suspect on the list. You know, Todd Fuss. You have this Michael Helgorth, and then this guy Gary Oliva, which really shocked me because if anyone fits the bill, that guy fits the bill. But again, he's exonerated for DNA, right? No DNA match for this guy. So
yeah,
that's what they're saying.
I don't know. Let's start with this. Here's where I want to begin this. We're going to start with Jason. Detective White, you know this crime scene. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the crime scene, of course, I think it's pretty well known throughout the world that has studied this case, is that the crime scene wasn't handled the way it's supposed to be via the textbook way. A lot of that's going to be attributed to a city that is never really faced with this type of a crime. I won't say never, but it's a very, very small amount of homicides that occur within their jurisdiction. And when you have one of this kind of a complexity where you have a ransom, possible kidnapping of a child, and or a murder of a child, that's going to be a very, very special type of a case to be working. Not to mention the fact of the publicity that's going to come your way, that's going to have that external pressures that exist on a homicide investigation that can really be distracting. That would include pressures from media, social interest groups, and just really all of the armchair quarterbacks and specialists that are going to say you're not doing this or doing that. I can't even imagine the immense pressure. So what are the problems that happen within this case straight out of the box? Well, they showed up at the scene and they didn't get the people out of there to basically keep that crime scene secure. I've been a cop for a long time, and I've showed up on crime scenes, and I've walked in there, and I've been like, why are these people in the house? You know, when you get there, that still happens to this day to an extent on some type of crime scenes that you might show up on. So this isn't something new. And I think that at that time, I think that the Boulder police rather, I think that they, were kind of standing around and they were just trying to get the information to start with. And they didn't remove the people from the house and take them downtown while maybe a contingency of crime scene, get a waiver, a search waiver to be able to go through the entire house from top to bottom and see if they can find any clues. I don't think that there was anything that was nefarious in there, on the police side. I mean, I don't think that by basically one of the things that they asked the Ramseys to do was to specifically John that I remember is that look around and see if you see anything that's out of place. I think that it would probably behoove them to be with him when they were going through the house and just kind of walking with him as opposed to letting him walk through the house freely. But so that's another problem, and you just can't do that. And then it's just inexperience, really. I really, and then you take the inexperience of that, and I think that you have a little bit of an ego with the police department where maybe they should have recognized relatively early that this is a case far beyond their expertise, and they probably should have reached out to the state police to step in and help them with their efforts on this particular situation.
I would agree, because when I heard them say, go check the house, and he had no chaperone, I was shocked. I was like, what? Because typically and I've heard it in the docuseries, I've heard it in many other docuseries, or the documentary, I'm sorry. It's usually the parents will look at. So why would they let him walk around unattended? Hypothetically speaking, he committed the murder. Now they're giving him the ability to go clean up what he needs to clean up. And then,
well, honestly, just to add to that, I don't think that their initial thought right there, straight out of the gate before the body was found, I don't think that it even dawned on them that the parents could have had anything to do with this at all, really.
Right.
So therefore, to them, I think that they're just kind of like letting them walk freely through the house or whatever. And everybody, just like I saw something where John Ramsey said, there was people cooking, making toast in the kitchen, and there's other people cleaning the dishes and wiping off countertops with Windex. Stuff like that. They just weren't thinking like that. And the Ramseys, of course, are not. If that's where we are wrong as the police, if we just explain what we need people to do and why we need them to do it, people will understand that. The Ramseys aren't used to a situation like this, of course. They've never had a child abducted and possibly taken from the house, et cetera, et cetera. They don't have a lot of experience dealing with the police. So the police really should have taken control of that scene at that very moment. And if the Ramseys decided that they didn't want to give them a voluntary search waiver, then they should have been working on a search warrant at that point. Period.
Right.
Just to be able to examine the scene.
Yeah, because they are treating it as a kidnapping. And, brings me to that ransom letter that was very odd places to put it on a stairwell. Like almost like whoever put it there knew that they would see it because what's the first thing they would walk to? I mean, it was a really, and then look, I'm no expert on writing. I'm not going to, if you look at the letter, there's a lot of inconsistencies in the letter I noticed it. It looked like a panic letter, like it was thrown together. And we'll get deeper into it because, the signature on it with victory and the initials. And then later on they're trying to attach it to this charismatic psychopath who's running a cult. The whole thing is strange. I mean, it was bizarre to me. So I'm going to go to Sandy. Sandy, the behavior of the father in all the clips you see, what is that? Is there anything telling for you?
So I kind of wish they would kind of stay a little bit longer with him sometimes when they would be interviewing him, but they only show brief moments. And so it's really hard. There's times where he does, I think when they're talking, what do they call him? Iceman or something like that.
Right.
I think initially they had termed him as being an Iceman because he seemed really distant. But then there's a moment later when they're talking and his eyes water up and everything. So he actually shows a pretty broad range, which is, that's why I wish they would have kind of stayed with him longer each clip. But if you notice, they don't really. And so it's kind of hard because he doesn't always consistently respond. Does it make sense? There are times where, and even when he they're like, well, what do you think about that? Oh, wow, that's impressive. You know what I mean?
Right.
He doesn't really elaborate. It's really short, which is, I don't know. If you were asking me about my child, I probably would rattle on because when you're in an emotional state, you tend to kind of go off a little bit like on a tangent. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I was always kind of surprised that he was just like a one-word response, I mean, I know people like, my father, for example, when my uncle passed away, he doesn't show emotion in crowds. I don't know it's a weird pride. He's very private about his sadness. Where me, I'm just, whatever I feel at that moment, it's out in the open, especially when it has to do with family or something of that nature. So some people, they experience it differently. That's what I kind of wish they would have stayed there longer so that way you kind of can see, So it's really hard to tell because there are people like that. They are very private and they're proudful and they will at all costs hold everything inside. But then at the same time, though, later on, he is willing to show that emotion. So that's what I'm saying is kind of inconsistent. He kind of didn't stay, that reserved, constrained individual through and through. So, like you're talking about, in your family, I'm sure he kind of stays that way always, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. It really just doesn't express any kind of feelings or concern in a crowd, I would say. I don't know what he does privately with his wife, but.
Exactly. So in this case, I'm going to assume that would be like a crowd because he knows that it's being, filmed, right?
Right.
So he knows that multiple people, obviously many people will be looking at this. But there's another time where his eyes water and he does show that emotional, connection.
Did you get an opportunity to look at this? And we didn't get a lot of him, other than what they expressed about him. But there were a few. Only really one clip where they approach him in the car. Is a Scott Carruthers guy. He's the beta cult leader. What did you make of that guy?
Yeah, it's funny because he does come across as a huge narcissist. And is, and that's why, I could kind of see him writing that letter. I know they were tying him to the letter. If you look at the letter, it has that flair of narcissism, but you can tell like in the letter, it seems like they're trying to prove themselves. Right. And so they, at the same time, they're kind of insecure and they have like some sort of like, they don't want to be seen as inferior, right? So it's like a competition. If you look at that letter, that's kind of how I felt when I looked at it. And with him, he has a narcissist, and I felt like, he wants to prove himself. But in that short, brief clip where they were trying to talk to him in the car, and and they talk about aliens, and he's like, "Well, do you?" He's like, "Well, no, neither do I."
Yeah, but he redirected there.
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't know, like some of the bizarre thinking and the delusions, I do see that in patients that actually are delusional. They tend to be like religious, and they'll tie in different religions and they'll put them together, and it's enough truth that's kind of like confusing because you're like, oh, well, that is true, but then they don't really connect well. You know what I mean? So like him taking parts of Kabbalah and this, that, and the other and kind of piecing it together. Actually, I have seen patients with delusional disorders do that.
Yeah, there's a video I watched from years ago where a very charismatic person was proposing a test. And without saying names or utilizing the name of a religion, a small number of people, he approached him about this religion. And the end of the day, about 80% of them were like, yeah, that sounds like like something I would be interested in. But they didn't realize that he was talking about the Jedi Knights. And so, but people were willing to subscribe to it. He was smart. He didn't utilize the name of the religion. He just spoke about their philosophy, and people seem to be on board with it. Scary business. So when you have this guy who comes off very firm and a narcissist, and it's even the way he presents himself, just in that small clip I saw of him, you could see in his redirect, he's very firm in his stance. Of course, yeah, he's persuading a lot of people. I don't want to say, dumb people, but fragile-minded people looking for answers. So then they came to the conclusion that the letters on the note that signed by and it did line up with him. But then it made me wonder, is he a scapegoat? Are they trying to blame it on him because this woman happened to know one of the people involved? It's such a weird story. It really is. Leslie, what did you make of this story?
I'm not sure what part you mean, but I'd like to speak a little bit about John and what I saw. And definitely he was subdued, quiet, pretty straightforward. And I know that the officers, they are trying to assess a situation when they get there, and the reaction of the people involved does play into their kind of view of what may have taken place. And we saw in the Scott Peterson case that when Scott didn't act in a way that they thought was appropriate for someone, then suddenly he became suspicious as far as a suspect. Obviously, Patsy was much more animated, much more verbal, much more emotional. But as a person, I think John was pretty much described as not being especially involved with the kids' activities, more of a go to work, provide for the family, come home and, be a responsible husband and father, but not especially someone who you would think would be animated, and especially under those circumstances. I was going to ask Jason if do you consider it a crime scene if it's a kidnapping? Because I know initially they didn't expect it to be a crime scene in terms of location of a murder, because they just came out thinking they had a kidnapping. I don't know, do you also then remove everyone from the house? I suppose you would, because if you thought you had an intruder, you wouldn't want anything disturbed. I did think it odd, considering the circumstances, that John was encouraged to go with, I think, a friend of his to go through the house, and happened to go down into the basement and then disturb the body, as we saw, which was crazy. It's understandable. Let's say he was not a suspect in the crime. He was just reacting emotionally to his daughter being in that situation and wanting to kind of preserve her and care for her by bringing her upstairs. But just seems like you'd know to leave the body alone and let someone know. It was a very interesting case. The ransom note brings up so many questions, the length of it, the contents, the way it was written, starting out sort of demanding and then sort of ending up with kind of pleading with John about, you have to make this decision. And very strange, just from the amount of money that they were demanding, and then the references to the movies, and that they used the paper from the household, all very odd. Who would take that much time to do that? If you went in there to do a kidnapping, you'd want to get in and out without being detected. And to sit there and write a note, for which would probably take at least 20 minutes. It's just all very suspicious, which of course I'm sure led them to suspect the parents.
Well, I'll answer your question just for a minute. And that was, you'd asked, would we consider this a crime scene straight out of the gate? Well, I think that when you look at the circumstances in which this call came into the police, absolutely. I mean, she talks about they know about this letter straight away. So when you take that in conjunction with a 6-year-old that's missing, then you're automatically going to go, and this should be a crime scene to the max. I mean, that's what I would assume that we would do here in Tulsa, or any other major city police department that's got any kind of experience with this. Listen, fortunately, most of us that do this business don't have a lot of experience with this type of a particular crime. It's super rare to be abducting a child. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's not something that many officers have to deal with throughout this country, thank heavens. But in this particular case, based on the circumstances and based on the evidence that was found by Patsy Ramsey, as far as the letter on the stairs and letting law enforcement know that right away, this absolutely should have been considered a major crime scene, so to speak, not necessarily a homicide scene, but a major crime scene. And because I could see it if the child was like a juvenile, where the cops might show up and consider that, this might be a runaway, or this might be, one of those deals where the kid's taken off on their own. That's completely different. But when you take the totality of the circumstances based on the age of the kid, I think you have to automatically assume that there's something seriously wrong here. And that would be my response to you in reference to that.
I agree that letter again. And this is my personal perspective. Either the person who wrote it had a poor education because the handwriting was atrocious. So I know the father didn't write because I had the ability to look at some of his writings. The guy wrote well. I mean, this guy made a lot of money in his career. He's, he rose to he's a very powerful entrepreneur. Or a panicked somebody that's writing that letter, put it like, oh, I didn't want this kid to die, and we were only supposed to hold it hostage, et cetera, et cetera. Because the I's, that stood out to me. The letter I throughout that letter, all of it, very inconsistent. The striking wasn't the same. The line in the I wasn't the same. So to me, it seems like someone wrote it panicked. But the other part, 118,000, really specific number. Really specific. And if you listen on later, a gentleman that was interviewed by the FBI agent retired, and then I believe detectives then, it was alleged that there was going to be 50 to 60,000 per individual. Now that tells me 3 people. If he said I'm going to come in it's this Michael what is it? Helworth?
Helworth. Yeah, I know who you're talking about. He's the burglar, the neighborhood burglar.
Right. He ends up dead after
killed himself.
Allegedly. And so you're hearing 50 to 60,000. So 60,000 times 3, you get that 118,000, right? That's where that comes to. It tells me there's 3 people involved. 3 people are going to split 118,000, and that equates to what the 60 case runs up to. Tells me there are 3 people involved. For someone to break into what I think that lower window, and I'm not familiar with those. That must be a northern thing. I've never seen a setup like that before, where you climb into this thing and there's a window below. There was a suitcase prop there, a scuff on the wall where clearly someone climbed up. Yeah, there had to have been more than one person involved, in my opinion. And outside of that, I think law enforcement should have took note they should have stood out right away. 118,000 is very, very specific. I'm not sure if they knew what his account was or how they have it arranged, but then you drive back to this guy, Scott Carruthers, this who's hired hitmen in the past, failed, has hired people to abduct young girls in the past. Typical cult leader. It's all about me and I have 4 wives, et cetera, et cetera. It's such a bizarre case, and it breaks my heart that this little girl's essentially not resting in peace. So, Jason, you're on the scene, and you come across this letter. You see this very specific number. You find these items in the house, like the suitcase up to a wall, scuff in the wall. And here's the other thing, too. The home alarm is not set that night. Did they ever mention if they normally set it, or if that was an odd occasion?
It sounded like rarely they set it, or just once in a while. I was curious about that too. I thought this was especially an affluent area of Boulder, which maybe Boulder is all affluent, but I thought, well, maybe it's a gated community. But when I looked at the pictures, it doesn't look like it was a gated community. It was just one of many in the neighborhood. And
well, it's not gated. I've driven by there like probably 3 years ago when I was up there to interview somebody in Colorado, in a Colorado prison. It's not gated, and it's readily accessible to just anybody, actually. But it is a very affluent area. Boulder's like that, so.
Yeah, they seem lax. I mean, we're talking the 90s, and even in the 90s where I lived in, and I'm pretty sure Sandy knows what I'm talking about, the East Lake area, where there's virtually no crime. But even the people I knew there growing up, their doors were locked. Alarms were on, and even though with no crime. So were they more lax? Perhaps so.
Well, I think obviously they were more relaxed because they had a number of people that paraded through their house like the night before. It was like, I couldn't tell you how many people walked through that house, but they had their house open to people to walk through their house. It was like almost like a parade of homes kind of deal, to look at people's homes around Christmas time in the area. And so I remember something along those lines where they had a number of people that walked through there, like a big giant party or whatever it was. So easily somebody could have managed to get down into the basement and unlock the window for a future visit. Or who knows? But I can tell you, just from my own perspective, and this is my own personal thing, when this thing happened a long, long time ago, and this is before I was a cop, I really just, to me, I just really wasn't this is my own speculation back then. I really didn't think the parents were involved. It just didn't look right to me. And all of these years since, I really haven't considered either one of them. Now, I do think that Patsy, I don't look at their reactions in their interviews as being anything really significant to me. And the reason what I'm taking that off of is that people react differently. You know, the husband's going to react different than maybe the wife. And I don't blame the wife for being pissed off, really, for basically getting accused, essentially, with some really pointed questions. So I really didn't see that. I honestly didn't believe that they weren't trying to be forthcoming. Of course, they're going to be panicked and they're going to start getting attorneys because they're starting to see the writing on the wall that, oh my gosh, they're thinking we did this and they're going to come after us. And sometimes when that happens, you know, you're in big problems. And you know, I know it's innocent until proven guilty, and that's the way things are supposed to roll. But I think everybody has, especially Sandy can probably agree with me on this, that you've heard many stories where people, you know, once you're locked up, it's really a tough road to go down to prove your innocence, so to speak. So I think that that's going to be another issue that you have to contend with as well. I agree. The letter, everybody will tell you, all the experts and stuff will stand up and say that letter, it's the letter. Now, when you look at Patsy's writing, it's inconclusive. I mean, there was an expert that I watched today in one of these videos. It could be her, and then again, it could be somebody else. And that's what they said in the grand jury. The thing that stands out to me is not necessarily the I, Adam. What stands out to me is the A. Nobody freaking writes that A, period. It's one of those from a typewriter. I mean, nobody writes that A. And of course, there was the regular A, small cased A, and then that weird A, and I've written it before, but that weird A that nobody writes, you know, and that's the one that I thought was weird. Clearly in the letter, it looks like somebody's trying to mask this, that they're trying to alter the writing or whatever to me, either that or the letters are really weird. What I will tell you that it's kind of an interesting little fun experiment to do. And I learned this a long time ago from a handwriting expert, kind of like not necessarily a person that compares letter, but it's like this lady, she was an expert at detecting the deception in oral and written statements. And one of the things that I remember her talking to me about was really interesting. And if you take this letter and you do the same thing on what I'm about to tell you, is take that letter and turn it upside down. And when you take letters that have been written by people that have written ransom letters or even witness statements, so to speak, like a rape victim that might write out a witness statement or any of those type of written witness statements, is turn them upside down and look at them, because you will automatically be able to tell the pattern, the writing patterns of where they're really nervous or it's really different, you know, kind of a deal. And it really stands out, especially when it's upside down. Huh. Now, I say this, when I say this, I say this to say another thing. This isn't something that you can walk into the court and go, hey, this person's lying right here, and it starts at this paragraph because this is where the writing gets all jacked up. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that these could be clues. When you look at statements like that, and you look at this letter too, but when you look at statements like this and you see the writing patterns change dramatically, that might be an area to focus in on, because that's the area where they're really kind of lying or whatever. This is a completely different type of a case than what I'm talking about, though, here, because we're talking about the number $118,000 for this bonus. Who in the heck would have known that? You know, I don't know. There's a lot of really, really impressive experts that I'm sure that have looked at this particular case, from the FBI profilers, which I don't know what their success rate is. I really don't know, but I would love to know what their profile was in reference to this specific killer. They're not always right. I know that that's a newsflash, but they're not always right. But I certainly would like to also know, what is their profile in reference to this particular type of a killer? What are their thoughts on it? First of all, it's a kidnapping for ransom. And I don't have a list of all the crimes that the FBI jumps in on straight out of the gate, but I would think that this is one of those that they are all over, you know.
Right.
I'm thinking that this is their jurisdiction to an extent. Maybe it's not, because they weren't a part of this. It doesn't look like from the early onsets of this case. But you would think that a ransom kidnapping of a child would fall under the jurisdiction of the FBI to some extent. I don't know. I think not only are the detectives a little bit at fault here, after realizing what the significance of this case is, I think that you have to also take a little bit of the blame and focus that towards their administration for not making the proper decision above them to make an executive decision that those guys, our detectives, are going to need help here. I mean, I don't know what the numbers of cases that each one of these homicide detectives, I don't even know if they have a homicide unit per se. They probably have more of a major crimes unit, honestly. I doubt that they have a homicide unit, but I would say a major crimes unit, which is probably a catch-all for all of the, from grand larcenies to a burglary to a robbery, maybe. That's probably what they focus on their investigations, and there's probably 2 or 3 of them that do it. So, but I think that there's a lot of people to blame in this particular case. There's a lot of things that jump out to me. And really, at the end of the day, when we're looking at this case, you've got DNA there. And one of the things that and I'm going to just talk one more minute, and then I'll give it to somebody else, I promise. The other thing that jumps out to me real quick that I at least want to mention is that DNA. And years ago, when I found out about that DNA existing, it's like in 3 places. It's like on the underwear. I think there's like 3 spots on, or maybe on one of the thighs,
right?
Things like that. But it's the same person that they believe, and it's the same contributor to this DNA. And I thought years ago, well, why don't they just do some forensic genealogy? Just do the snapshot pair bond DNA and do the forensic genealogy from there. And here we go. Let's start researching who this is. I mean, that's probably how a lot of these killers are getting caught. I mean, I'm sure that the Long Island killer came from that, the Idaho killer. This is going to be from forensically looking in family trees. My guess is that the quality of this DNA is not even close to being to that level to where they're able to do that technology. Otherwise, they would have done it.
I agree.
3 years ago.
I agree. Because, the argument with a couple of people I'd spoken to is, again, they brought up the 118,000. I'm like, well, 3 ways is 180,000. If they're talking 60,000, if it's 50,000, you're talking 150,000. So if there's 3 people involved, obviously someone's getting a lesser cut, which I think the guy that committed suicide is the lesser cut. He did have high-tech boots on, but they were not the same size. He did have a stun gun on his person. He did own a mag flashlight that they found there that he no longer had. Allegedly, it's his prized possession. And the DNA is the curious part. You're right. The genealogy. Okay. Maybe. Well,
I've said it all along. I've talked about this case when we give tours around our office, and I give tours. I talk about it every time, and I'm like, listen. I wanted to call Boulder PD personally, but I didn't want my boss going, "Did you really call Boulder PD?"
Right.
Well, you would have probably gotten a phone call going, "Are you serious? You seriously called them?" Because they have to be living under a rock not to know that you can do this. So I would just assume, and I'm sure that they have looked at this. I have no doubt in my mind that they probably, if they didn't, that's crazy. They had to have explored the option of doing pair bond snapshot DNA and doing some forensic.
Well, here's the
genealogy.
Thing. So John Ramsey pressured them for more advanced DNA testing. So much so that we're talking in this guy Gary Oliva, whatever. John Ramsey hired a PI to watch this guy. I'm not sure why he had interest. They didn't really state it in the documentary. I didn't see it anywhere else, but he had something made him mentally think of this person. I find out later that guy was receiving his mail like 13 houses away from the Ramsey home through a church.
Well, I'll tell you how his name came up. Is there was a guy that basically called the cops literally either the day of this murder or the next day. And he says, "Hey, listen, you need to know that this guy called me. His name is Gary Oliva, and I know him. I went to high school with him, and he called me in the early AM hours and said that he had killed he hurt a little girl on the very day that this thing happened." And this is before this had even been public knowledge. That's why he was on the radar from the very early onset of this thing. And then from there, this guy that called this tip in, this is his claim of it. And there's actually a video on it that's on YouTube that just came out recently, and it's one with somebody on Court TV. I can't remember the guy's name, but it was a Court TV interview. And on that, he talks about how they never came and interviewed me. They never even bothered to come to interview me. So that's where that name came up originally.
It makes me wonder why they didn't look further into him. I mean, I guess DNA exonerated him, right? I mean, but then, if you look at this case, so the other thing too, fibers from her clothing were found inside the suit. The fibers of the clothing she was wearing were found inside a suitcase that was in the room propped against a wall. Was her body small enough to fit in there? I don't know. I mean, you only got a picture of the suitcase. Sandy, let me ask you a question. If someone's this guy, Gary, gives me the impression that he had an obsession with JonBenet Ramsey. And maybe that's what part of the reason John took a further look. Maybe he was doing more than what public is made known to. But when you get these guys in prison and they have obsessions with outside people. How often is it that you come across people in prison taking claims for things they didn't do? Is that a common thing?
Actually, not that much. At least it hasn't been my experience. They have these cards, like game cards that they have, like, they use them to see if any of the inmates recognize the perps and the victims. And it's kind of weird because they'll be like, oh, I know this, you know what I mean? And so they'll actually, it's like playing cards, believe it or not. And they have faces and to see if they can identify. And I have seen some that have claimed that they've done more crimes. Like I've been on death row. Some of the inmates there have claimed more victims than what they actually, were sentenced for. They were charged with. I have seen that, but not fixated like that. They don't continue the fixation with somebody like that. I don't think I've ever seen that.
It's bizarre. Yeah, because that guy, when they arrested this Gary guy, he had photos of JonBenet, probably from media photos. He had a poem he wrote for her. He had a stun gun in his possession because on her body, on her face, and on her back were stun gun marks, or that's what we're assuming anyway. They're burn marks. Her murder was. It's not. Here's where I run into this problem with this letter and this number that they use and etc. It's seeming like it wants to be a kidnapping, but I'm thinking they're using it to shield ultimately what they did wrong. They're like, well, because she was stun gunned, she was strangled and then struck with a blunt object. It's pretty. That's over the top. That's brutal. And this is a tiny little girl. And
don't forget sexually assaulted
and sexually assaulted. This list of people we have, it seems to be the common thread of minus Todd, the original guy Todd, because there's two Todds here. There's Aaron and Todd, the brothers, Sholan from Hawaii, and then you have Todd Fuss, which Todd Fuss doesn't have really a background in pedophilia, but the majority of these other people on the list are in and around this. And what makes this bizarre is that all these people could fit the bill. This Todd Fuss guy, he was dating this woman. Her daughter was involved with these pageants. They were in the same place. He seemed to be really proud of her wins, or at least they sensationalized that in the documentary. I got to tell you, it's a bizarre thing. So this guy, Gary, has these photos of her and he's wrote her a poem, and his background's in pedophilia. They actually arrested him on child pornography. And then he's made this confession, both in a phone call and then multiple letters to his old friend. And yet, I don't remember hearing his name once through media ever until recently. So it's.
Well, I would like to say also, I watched the same YouTube video that Jason did. And from what this guy said, that was a friend of Gary's, he said he had called in that day as soon as he saw in the paper that JonBenet had been murdered. Her body had been found in Boulder. He reported it and didn't hear anything from anyone for 3 months.
Huh.
No one ever contacted him, and he called back again 3 months later saying the same thing and was never contacted by anyone, which is really odd because, like you, Adam, there were so many things that pointed to him. I mean, the phone call, if that really happened, as his friend claimed to have happened, that just seems way too coincidental. I mean, they could put him in that same area living there during that time and that he confessed to it. It wasn't until I took some notes, but it wasn't until about 4 years later that he was arrested on the University of Colorado campus, and they found those photos of JonBenet still in his possession with that poem.
It's creepy. That's creepy. Let's talk about some of these suspects. I'll ask Jason this one. This Aaron and Todd, it's Shonlu from Hawaii, where one of the brothers is in prison for murdering a little girl who ironically looks a lot like JonBenet. Another little girl was missing, and they thought he had something to do with it. I'm not sure what the conclusion that was. Do we know if they got DNA from either brother, or because it would have to be Todd?
I'm sure. No, I'm sure that they have DNA from the both of them. I just think that, but I will also tell you, I can't think of how many times I've heard of some killer that's been sitting in prison forever that his DNA is on file supposedly in CODIS, and yet they never got a hit from it. So I think that it may be something to where the authorities, if they haven't gotten a hit from him, I wouldn't necessarily trust that straight away. What I would do is I would contact those people that handle CODIS and say, let's make sure that has been referenced against this person specifically. I don't know why there has been delays like that, but I have personally seen that happen where you're like, why the heck didn't this guy freaking come up years ago? And I'm trying to think of a serial killer that this was one of those instances where there was a pretty notorious serial killer
that they
Simpson. Never got a hit off it. No, what? O.J.
Simpson was so Glenn Rogers was hanging around O.J. Simpson Glenn Rogers was using another name. A victim he had killed, he stole the guy's identity, was actually painting a house for O.J. or some. And I have a whole episode towards that, but that itself, because that Glenn guy, if they would have like cued into this guy during the OJ thing, there'd be a lot of people alive thereafter, because that guy killed a lot of people after that. But that's a good example.
Well, I'm just saying that I don't know, and here I am. I work in Homicide right now, and there's going to be somebody that's going to type in and make me look stupid, I guess, probably at some point. But here's the deal: I'm sure there is something that. I know that there's been times when we're like, hey, you need to run this guy again and just double check. And they're like, oh, well, he should already be in there. Well, you have to trust a lot of people to do the right thing here. You got to trust that the DOC people in the prison system is actually going to take the swab, take the time to do whatever the heck it is that they do to make sure that this thing gets entry into that. And that may not have happened. I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying anything against people that work in prisons, but I don't know what their policies or what they end up doing. Who knows? That thing may not have even gotten in there. Furthermore, let's hope it's the same person that's supposed to get swabbed, that swab ends up in an envelope sometime. Who knows? I don't know. But if it's one of those people that is strongly one of those people that they have all of these things that come up, because in this particular homicide, I'm just going to say, and I'm not a criminal profiler at the FBI, but I will tell you, I would guess that this person most certainly is going to have some child molestation or something along those lines at a minimum in his background. And then I would guess a murder later, or either before or after. I mean, this is just my thought. This is a pretty significant type of a murder. I certainly wasn't thinking of the brother. I don't remember how old the kid was, but I wasn't thinking that a 10-year-old is going to do this to his sister if he was around 10 or whatever. It just didn't strike me as something as plausible. But I don't know. The DNA is the key thing here. Either it's if they can exclude these people, then let's hope that the DNA is going to advance to a whole nother level. I mean, we never thought we'd be at a point where we can get a picture of somebody based off of a DNA strand, and now we can. Virtually a picture to show what the facial characteristics of a human being looks like based off of a DNA strand. So who knows, in the near future, they may be able to, and I think that they have ways to construct DNA too and build it out further based on whatever. I don't know. That's a scientist answer. A scientist would have to answer that. And DNA is kind of, it's a little bit more complex than I would be able to explain.
Well, I'll tell you this. Because I listen to a lot of documentaries. Science is already talking about taking your DNA, and if let's say you get into a car accident, lose a limb, they're talking about 3D printing your limb. They predict in the next decade this is going to be something to do.
Well, let me mention this real quick, because I think this is something that I've always kind of toyed around with in my brain, and I don't know that it'll ever happen because, humanity, they're always concerned about DNA. DNA is just like anything else. They don't like cameras through communities. They don't like anything where Big Brother's watching. They always have this concern that people are going to reconstruct this person or whatever else based off DNA. But here's the thing. I've always kind of thought that it would be super helpful for us because there's much less restrictions when it comes to cities and their DNA databases, and then states has a little bit more restrictions. And then, of course, you have the federal CODIS, which has a lot more restrictions, right? So I always thought that, when you have these unattended deaths of people or anybody that goes to the medical examiner's office, let's just say for a start, whether they be suicide or unattended deaths, that there's a swab of their blood, a blood card, because they go to the medical examiner's office and there's going to be a blood card of that person generally, that gets turned into a property receipt and maybe even a DNA done on it and just stuck in the local database to see if there's any hits from any other crimes that have happened previous. I'll tell you right now that the person that did this, had he never been arrested or something, or it was pre-days when they didn't, maybe it was back in the days when they didn't take DNA swabs from people. If this person's already dead, which is quite possible, the suspect in this case, you may never, ever, ever, ever figure out who this DNA belongs to because of that, So I don't know. I always thought it'd be interesting if we kind of upped the game a little bit and took the people's DNA when they die from suicide or whatever, or one of those type of deaths, and just had it stored in a database, because you'd be surprised at how many crimes would be cleared based on that, potentially.
So yeah, this guy Michael Helgoth, I didn't hear anything about DNA from him. I think they, because of the shoe size, wrote him off. I don't think they.
Well,
realized.
They did. They excluded him via DNA. But he was kind of my favorite for all these years, just because. For many reasons. Number one, I mean, I think that one of the things that was said was that guy that worked with him in the wrecking yard is that I thought it was like the way he put it. It sounded to me like this kid was going to do it with somebody else, like
Right.
They were going to do it together and go do this burglary. And I've never heard of who this other person could have been,
Right.
And that would be interesting to know how much they dove into his history to see who he was hanging around with, and maybe did they get his phone? Because I thought it was interesting that he had the high tech boots, and super interesting to me that he killed himself like a day or two after the news conference had been held, stated that they were narrowing in on a suspect. This kid's not going to know what DNA they have or not. Maybe it's possible that he was there with somebody else, and somebody that he was there with did this.
It's very
and that maybe it's right there in front of him, and that's a possibility.
This is pretty common with people in that age group and in that area. I looked this up. How many people are buying high tech boots in that area in the 90s? Big number of people. I know, because I owned a pair when I was a kid. So the point
he was a burglar in that specific area too.
Yes.
That bears mentioning.
And so he had a group of friends that were questionable, probably wore the same boots. If they're in coordination about this crime, if they're planning a crime, the way this guy comes off to me with the mag light and the way they're thinking, let's all put our high-tech boots on. It's not impossible they coordinated this. And you're right. There is possibly someone that no one's even bothered looking at his circle of people, at least not what I've heard, right? And
well, one would hope. One would hope.
So let's do this. Let's say Jason White gets a phone call from FBI. So look, man, we want to put a task force together, right? And you pick up Sandy as a psychologist to interview the people once they're brought in along with you. Where do you start this investigation? Like, I watched this guy. He came into it. He's a retired FBI agent, and he seemed to know all the right things. But I have to bear in mind he's on television, and they're probably giving him cues of what he should or shouldn't do for effect. But for you have your team. Where do you start as a cold case in this?
Well, you got to completely just dissect the case and go through it and comb through it from the all of the files. You need to go through everything and make sure that it's organized, for starters. In this particular case, I saw more volumes of books on this case than when they just showed a breakaway, and I'm seeing 15 books that are thick. I've never seen a case that's that massive. That is an incredible amount of work. The one thing that gives me hope here in this particular case is that there's still people that are working it. People that were friends of that other detective or relatives of his own granddaughters, actually. And people are still sitting around a table, people that have been prior homicide detectives that are sitting around, and they're actually dedicating their life to this to actually work it, because this case very easily could be sitting on a shelf in Boulder PD's room and not even touched. Okay. Right. That's just the realism of it. So the first thing you do is you take these cases and you take the case books and you go through it piece by piece and preserve everything in those books. Because I'm telling you right now that if this stuff was typed a typewriter was used, those letters off that typewritten paper, it falls off over a matter of years. Trust me, I've experienced this from old cases. They disappear. You've got to preserve it, digitally scan this stuff in, save all of the photos that are off of floppy disk, because that's probably floppies back then. I know there were floppies because they had floppies when I was around. So you have that's going on. Then you have anything that's CD. You just need to digitize everything, right, including interviews. Then painstakingly go through each item of evidence, and let's just go through here and let's see what has been tested and what hasn't been tested. I saw something just in researching this that they found a handful of items of evidence that had not been tested. I can't even believe that that's possible at this point, 25 years later, maybe 27 years later, and yet there's still a few pieces of evidence that they have discovered that haven't been tested, which that personally I'm actually stoked about it because maybe something will come from it.
Hopefully.
But that's what you're going to find, and you're going to see, and you have a team together of this, not just one person, a team of people. That way they kind of catch one another to make sure it's like a fail safe, to make sure that this person's doing what they need to be doing and that they don't miss something too. Because one person looking at a case is one thing, but another person looking at the same photos, they may perceive things differently than this person. So it's also helpful to do that. And that's what I would recommend. And not that if they ever put a task force together, I can promise you I'm not going to be the call that they're going to make. But if they did put one together, that's what I would insist upon. You're not building a rocket here. This is not that complicated. You just basically, it's a complicated case. I'm not saying this case is not complicated. We're talking about a different era. No audio, or there's no cameras on neighborhood cameras like they have nowadays. You have cameras on major intersections and highways in some of these major cities today. They're called flock cameras. That didn't exist back then. You didn't have the cell phone technology that you do today, where you would be able to do things like cell phone tower dumps and to get every number that goes through a cell phone tower, maybe, or whatever other electronic data that exists out there in the world that I won't get into because it's kind of secret stuff. But stuff that they are able to do that they didn't have that back then. They had to rely upon witnesses and maybe getting a fingerprint and really DNA back then. And what year was this? 96? 96 DNA was still in its infancy in a courtroom.
Yeah, you actually had to fight it to get in a courtroom. It was almost.
You did. I mean, look at the OJ case. The OJ case was in 94. The DNA was it's hard for anybody to wrap their head around. Even today, if you're a detective, it's still complicated stuff. So that even knowing how to properly package items back then, you want to make sure that those items weren't not, even if they were not handled appropriately back then for future DNA testing, then you may need to consider repackaging those items into another package potentially, because if they weren't put in paper, you could be having some serious problems with degrading or mold or things along that nature. So,
well, let's do a rule out.
I don't know. It's a big undertaking.
Let's do a rule out. We'll start with Leslie. Leslie, Gary, is it Oliva? How do you say it? Oliva?
Oliva. I think it's Oliva.
All right, so let's rule out. Do you think he has something to do with it, or is he just someone who's obsessed?
Well, he's definitely up at the top, I guess, of my list of people I would think is quite possibly responsible, except for the DNA. So What does that tell you?
I mean, that rules him out. I mean, he's just one of these people that saw the headlines and became obsessed, right? Sandy, Gary, is on your list? Are we ruling this guy out?
I mean, for me, I like to always be objective. If DNA ruled him out, then I'd rule him out.
Right. So now let's talk about the two brothers, Aaron and Todd. Well, we know it's not Aaron. He was in prison when it happened. Todd happened to move to the area, worked odd ends jobs. He was also implicated in a lot of violent crime, alleged that he had some pedophilia or something with children. I mean, it's hard to say. Maybe, between the two of them, they can't be that far different. So do we rule these guys out? Now I know DNA ruled them out. So we rule them out?
Yeah, I think if DNA's ruled him out, I would rule him out. Having dealt with a lot of pedophiles in prison, they are capable of some pretty heinous crimes. And I'm sure Jason hopefully has not come across many of them, but wouldn't be surprised. And, you know, when I was looking at the letter in this entire case, I was always trying to be like, all right, what's a different angle that you can come out? And so I even was like, well, what if you had somebody dictating to somebody else to write the letter? And that's why there's like that, some of the misspelling and things like that, the way it's written. Because what if I was telling somebody to write?
Right.
They would have not really captured everything. So, you know, when they were saying there was more than one person, maybe there really was. One person was telling the other person what to write. And then I started playing with the 118, and you were talking about 3 people and everything. So what if you said, instead of saying 180, they registered 118, and there you got 118?
Right.
I don't know.
Right. Because
180,
that
118.
That was a big question for me, because if it's being split 3 ways and the 118 doesn't compute to 3 ways at 60K, nor does it do that at 50K, which means someone took a lesser pay. But maybe you're right. Maybe who dictated the letter to them, they heard 118. What really they should have wrote 180, because what was verbally promised to one guy, because remember, the witness said, "Oh, I'm going to come in like 50 or 60,000 or something of that nature." The math isn't there, but you're right. Maybe they were dictated. The letter was dictated, and they misheard it, or just miswrote it, or misremembered it, which leads me back to. So real quick, Jason, Gary, Aaron, and Todd, the brothers, we're ruling those guys out, right?
Well, I don't know a whole lot of the history behind this too. The first person I'm going to be ruling out is anybody that works in the lab that might have done some DNA testing on these items, in addition to the police officers that may have had any kind of part in collecting this evidence. I mean, is it possible that somebody might have got DNA contaminated any of these items, and we're pissing up a rope here, and we're not going to find out whoever this person is, because it could be it's been known where somebody could have contaminated an item per se. This is the 90s. In the 90s, or at least in the 80s for sure, you would see people. I was just sitting in on listening to somebody from the Night Stalker case, and you see crime scene photos of them touching things with no gloves on.
Yeah.
So that would be the first thing that I would do, is I would get DNA from everybody that had any involvement touching anything in this case, just to make sure that it's not a possibility that there was something that might have been contaminated. That's easy to do. It should be done. And that way it'll answer that question for the future. And then as far as any of these other people, as far as I'm concerned, the DNA is important, because the locations of where the DNA is located, the inner thigh, the underwear, and if memory serves, and I don't remember seeing this, and I don't want to say something incorrectly, but I could have swore I heard something that the garrote had a little bit of trace DNA on it as well. That was, there was 3 areas. I know that. Right. The neck or the garrote or something like that. That right there, those are the 3 main things to me: the DNA, and of course the letter. I mean, that thing's been exhaustively looked at. I'm sure they've done DNA or they've done fingerprint examinations on that. Apparently there's nothing, because we would have heard something by now, I would think. Yeah. But that's what I would say. I think anybody, we have to focus on the DNA at this point. You know what the great example of this whole thing is that this is a great example on how to handle a crime scene, or how not to, rather. And it should be the case that's taught in every single police academy across this country on. This is something of you don't do it this way. Okay. And I'm not I'm not attacking the cops there, because I don't think they knew any better, really. But this is a great example of that, and how to collect evidence appropriately and do all this, that, and the other, and how to really stop everything and keep the media at bay. Yeah, the media. I really don't exclude anybody. But if the DNA came back and they've been excluded via that, then I wouldn't probably be wasting my time on anything other than continuing to dig and find out who could have been knowing people who may have been in that house or that road.
Financially speaking, or mastermind speaking, this Scott Carruthers guy, he was. I mean, we know to a certainty through plane records and eyewitness statement that he was between Maryland and Colorado often, so much so that it's being alleged that he attended the same church as the Ramsey family during the Christmas thing, and he could have been using that to scout out, dare I say, victims, and then utilize weaker minds to. And this is what he does: he paid people money to do certain things. And he very well could have masterminded. So this Todd Fuss guy does not seem to me like a mastermind, period. There's no way. The Michael Helgorth guy, he's definitely no mastermind. So someone was influencing them. And I think, so if I had to run it through my head, this guy finds this girl, she's a beauty pageant winner, she's a beautiful little girl, probably going to honor whatever deity he was worshiping, or alien for that matter, and said, I want this girl, and this is the way we're going to do it. And then perhaps, like Sandy said, maybe dictated a kidnap letter to them, which... So even saying this out loud, it's such a bizarre case, that all the people involved, I still, the one thing I still don't see other than, sexual deviance, I still don't see the motive. That's the part I'm fumbling on. I still don't see the motive for what happened to him outside of it being a sexual assault. Yet, the person that did this had the presence of mind to write this letter and use this very specific number, which he may or may not got wrong. It's so strange. So let's look at Michael. I like what Jason said, that if he's because the guy committed suicide after the press release, right? Like the day after, pretty certain of that.
Yeah, like a day or two after that.
And yes. So we didn't look at his circle of people. It's very likely that if he did this, he did it with another person, and the other person was probably the assailant of the sexual assault. It's troubling. It's really troubling because now this guy's perished, and we really should have. If I'm on this case, I'm the detective. I'm looking at this guy. I'm looking at his circle of people, who he's been around. I don't know if they could, like you said, phone records for the 90s. I'm not quite sure what they would do. I mean, if the guy had a cell phone or if he had a hard line. I know hard line you could track calls. If he had a cell phone, there's a ledger of it, but they didn't really look too closely at this guy. Because Todd Fuss, let's get this out of the way. Does anyone here? We'll start with Leslie. We'll move to Jason, then we'll move to Sandy. Does anyone think Todd Fuss has something to do with this?
I don't know that name. I didn't run across a video that spoke about him, so I'm going to have to pass on that.
Yeah, he was in the Hulu special. So his ex called from prison to basically name him in the murder of JonBenet. Mm-hmm. And she did that her motivation to do that was out of revenge. Even this guy, FBI guy Clark, was a little, when they asked, like, well, at a scale of 1 to 10, how trustworthy is he? I think he said like 5 or 6. And Sandy can tell you when they're in prison and they can see a light or a way out, they'll say just about whatever, even if it's tangible or if they fabricate some. So that's his story. In my observation, I don't think he had anything to do with it. And if he did, he was a very minuscule role. And he's following the script pretty well. Jason, what do you think of this Todd Fuss guy?
Well, like I said, I don't really know a whole lot about that one either, but I will tell you this, that if his wife's calling from prison, I'm not going to discount it. Listen, when you cast a play in hell, then you don't have angels as actors. So that's one of the sayings that exists for that. And if you're going to hear from somebody that's in prison, that doesn't mean that they're not telling you the truth. I mean, I deal with people that are in trouble all the time that tell me all kinds of stuff, and a lot of times it's true. So it's could she be motivated to do it in another way? I'm sure. I would be interested as to whether or not they tried to polygraph the guy. Did they go and talk to him? What was his response when they went to talk to him? Where was he? I mean, people leave a pretty decent footprint around wherever they've been throughout their life. And so, it would depend upon what their investigative efforts were and how they were able to exclude him is what I would be interested in.
Right. So Agent Clark sat him down for an interview, and he picked up on mediocre amounts of deceit, where he could gauge when he was telling the truth on his eyes and the way he was engaging with him versus when he asked him a little bit more complex question where he would look away. And so,
well, listen, let me tell you something real quick, just briefly. I don't know. I don't know this guy, and I don't know what his level of expertise is, and he might be just super amazing. I don't know, but I don't put a lot of stock into looking up to the left and looking away, right, and all this, that, and the other stuff that's read stuff. I just gauge my opinion off of people and just in general, just having a conversation with them. I don't know what he's referring to with respect to that. I think I would be very, very cautious of claiming that this guy's lying here or there based on him looking up to a different direction.
Right.
I just don't put a lot of stock into that because everybody is so different. That's one of the reasons that the read technique, it's a tool. I think it's great, and I think that it's a good tool for cops to go to. But I don't really think much about that. I think about just really how people are. You can tell usually. Not some people are exceptionally great liars, and I get fooled from time to time. But I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock into it based on those telltales that he's talking about.
Right. Sandy, Todd Fuss, what are your thoughts?
I'll probably end up being hated by probably yet another FBI guy somewhere along the line. But
yeah,
that's just the way I've.
That's just the way of it. People, we're going to form our opinions, and people are not going to like them, and they're going to like them. And that's what makes this great. This is just a conversation. People get to eavesdrop. Sandy, what do you think of Todd Fuss? What are your thoughts on him?
Kind of like you had said, he's not the brightest individual. So I don't think he was like a mastermind behind any of this. He was pretty quick about saying, yeah, sure, swab me for the DNA. When the former FBI agent asked him if he'd be open to being swabbed for DNA.
Yep.
So they could match. He was quick. So if he has anything to do with it, I think his conscience was pretty clear that he wasn't involved as far as anything that would require DNA. Does it make sense? So I probably wouldn't kind of spend too much resources on him, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. I mean, he was very quick. Yeah, go ahead, swab me. Like, he had zero concern for that. So he, in his mind, I'm innocent of the assault. What role he might have played, or forget the role. What he might know, if there's any deceit in him, it might be what he knows. Because the only thing I did notice is when they asked him about the scrapyard, did you go get parts for the scrapyard? He answered the question before the guy finished asking the question. So he was like the guy said in the show, he was prepared to state that. He had the foresight to know that question was coming, and he answered that question way before the guy even finished the sentence of the question itself. So he may or may not know something.
And I did notice that he immediately was like, oh, yeah, I'd been there with Cinnamon, which was his daughter,
right? Which
I'm sure is true. And that's what a lot of, criminals do end up doing. They put enough truth to it, you know what I mean, where they can get by. But they always tend to omit. So I'm sure he did, go with his daughter, but he probably left out the fact that he probably had been there with Bernice, which is his, ex-wife.
Right. Yeah. And so does he notice Michael Helgoth guy? I think he did, because for when he asked him the question, he shut the question down and he redirected. He went to the story more or less of like what he was doing there with his daughter, for what part. It was, so I don't know. I don't know what to think of him. I don't think he was the assailant. Definitely was not the mastermind. There's no shot in the dark that guy's a mastermind. He definitely did not see any profit or get paid by anyone for it, because it reflects on his life directly. And they didn't see anything in his past showing that he's ever spent great amounts of money. So what this boils down to now is we have a suspect who is passed on, and that's this Michael Helgoth guy. And we don't know, because he wore a high-tech boot. He did have a mag light that was missing. Like what Jason said, why were there no fingerprints? If there were fingerprints on the flashlight, I didn't hear about it. The parachute type thing that that JonBenet was strangled with is it's a rope, like a parachute rope, I believe, not made of nylon. Where did it come from? Unknown. It's being said that either an aluminum bat end or a golf club could have been a blunt instrument involved with it. Which one it is, unknown. This case has a lot of unknowns, and it's troubling. So, and I can't even point the finger at this cult leader, Scott Carruthers. However, he is bizarre. Like, that guy is bizarre. When you read more about that guy outside of this case, he's a strange dude, man. He's basically convinced a large group of people to believe that he was an alien deity, and that something to the note that Jesus might have been an alien. It's crazy. And, like other people, if they want to believe something or they hear one or two things that line it up, they firmly stand behind it. So it's a problem. The whole case is a problem. And I feel bad for John Ramsey. So I'm going to ask everyone this. We're going to start with Leslie, go to Jason, go to Sandy. Leslie, John Ramsey, the father. In my opinion, I don't think he had anything to do with her death. You?
Well, I just want to bring up the original possibility that was suggested, and that was that the 9-year-old son accidentally killed his sister, and then the parents had to scramble to figure out what to do, and they covered it up by writing the letter. And I'm just very taken with the length of time I think that letter took to be written, and that there are 2-3 suspects sitting in the Ramsey house while the parents are upstairs asleep, and they're writing a letter on their note paper using their pens in the house. It just seems really far-fetched to me. I am glad that Jason mentioned the idea, which had kind of occurred to me, I hadn't put words to it, but to somehow be sure that the DNA that we're excluding all these potential suspects because of that is indeed the DNA has integrity, and that we are matching it up knowing that is an exclusionary tool. I don't know, John Ramsey, I watched a more recent interview, and he's still funneling money into searching out the killer. And that's why I think that this case is much different than all the other child abductions and murders that have gone cold. And this one still is in the limelight, is because he's funneled money into it and gotten people to continue to work on it, as well as that one detective, John Schmidt, who was obsessed with the case, and his granddaughters, like Jason said, are now carrying that on. So I don't know. I think anything's possible. I think I did read at one point that there was a task force that the Boulder Police Department was going to consult, a cold case task force that worked for the state of Colorado. That was supposed to happen this year. I couldn't find anything that gave an update about that, but there are a lot of unanswered questions and still suspects out there. And I don't think anyone is completely clear of possibility.
Yeah, I heard this thing too about the son might have did it accidentally and the parents wanted to cover up. I'm going to poke a hole in that. If they did, yeah, the letter makes sense. The still that number, that odd number. But there's no shot a relative of that family, especially the mother, would cover up this long, because no one could hold a secret that long. But the assault of her, the sexual assault of her, there's no way to say, hey, you know what? To cover this up for our son, we're going to both strangle her, hit her with a taser gun, hit her with a blunt object, and then sexually assault her and put her in the basement. There's no shot that they would go to that extreme. That's crazy. I've heard this in a lot of different places, like, oh, the kid did it and we're going to cover it up. That's horseshit, period. As far as the contaminated DNA, especially in that era, in the 90s, 100%. It could be the fact that it's been contaminated. I don't know where we go from there with that, because it definitely did not match any of the relatives, and it was nowhere in a database. So that's the big question mark. Whose DNA is it? How corrupted is it? How did we repair it with today's technology and what we're talking about doing? And I mean, Elon Musk is already talking about putting a chip in your brain to both repair people with brain damage and then access media in your own mind. That's coming. We're talking about 3D printing limbs from DNA, your own heart. If you need a heart transplant, you have your own heart. So DNA is a huge factor in that. So I don't know. So Jason, what do you think of John?
Absolutely not. I mean, when I look at him in all of the interviews that he's done and just the way he conducts himself still to this day, I have zero thought, and I could be wrong, But really, my gut is telling me he absolutely has no idea as to who did this, or that he has zero involvement in any of this. That's just my opinion.
I agree, especially when he's putting in. We're not talking little bits of money. This guy's putting big money into keeping us alive, to tracking down the killer. This guy's putting money into it, so it's not.
But Leslie, I don't want you to feel bad about that. I mean, because I like number one, I like the fact that you're thinking outside of the box, and that's really what it takes.
Right.
And not to be narrow-minded. I mean, that's one of the things that gets people, and that's what got them early on in this investigation, is they immediately thought it was the parents, and they thought nobody else could possibly be involved in this. And time is of the essence on a case like this. I don't know how long phone records existed back then from a phone company. They could have put their net out a little bit further, and some of these names when they're coming up, and they might have been able to get phone data on some of these people. Let's just say, hypothetically speaking, that the DNA did happen to belong to an employee, that it was a cross-contamination situation. Well, can you imagine the black eye that they would have on their department if that was the case? And the whirlwind of it would be horrible, really. Yeah. And I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just saying that is a potential. I would hope that they have looked at that and they've tried to exclude anybody that has been touched to this case in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
But as far as John, I mean, listen, this guy, can you imagine what both of those parents and the son went through? They were looked at. They were probably the most hated people in the country, or if not the world. I mean, everybody thought that they had something to do with it, or most people did. And try walking down the street when people are yelling and screaming that you're a murderer and you're trying to grieve, for God's sakes. Mm-hmm. I can't even imagine. Yeah. I'm surprised that they even. I'm thankful that they didn't kill themselves or something crazy, because literally just the lynch mob that existed in this country for those people, I can't even imagine what life was like for them overnight. But
yeah, I remember.
My heart actually goes out to them, really.
I remember being a kid and hearing people bash them. And with Leslie, I think Leslie was referencing the people out there on both Reddit and other sites that were saying the son did it and they're covering. That's what she was referencing. I don't think that's her belief system.
No, all right. And I don't care. Even if she does think that, I actually appreciate the fact that you're even considering that, because I'm not excluding anybody.
Right.
Just the ones that I'm just telling you, based on DNA, to me, I'm moving on from those that are a no match and moving on to other people as potentials, as opposed to consistently or continually looking at those people. But that's just my thought. But as far as the dad, heck no, I don't have any thought at all that he has anything to do with it. That's me, though.
Right. Sandy,
well, in reality, I would vote for Gary Oliva. I mean, depending on the DNA.
Me too.
The handwriting's pretty close.
It really is. It really is. That's the scariest part, is that his handwriting is not far off. So the DNA exclusion, and maybe Jason's, maybe you're right. It got so corrupted they couldn't get a good DNA on him. But yeah, he really stuck out to me largely. Sandy, John, the father, what are your thoughts?
I don't think he did it. I mean, so looking at the facts that we know, that obviously there was she had been raped, and how everything, that's objective, right? Those are the facts. And knowing sex offenders and everything, they don't stop.
Right.
At some point, they're going to slip. And with somebody who had been living under so much scrutiny for how many years now?
Forever.
He would slip. And so, outside of everything, he doesn't fit the profile. In my mind, he does not fit the profile. I don't see him at all. I agree with Jason completely. I really don't see him really being involved like that. And mentioning the brother as a cover-up, if it was a cover-up, then that means there would have been mistakes. Right. So there's no way they've been able to clean up all the DNA so neatly. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's the thing. I do think this was planned, and maybe it was a kidnap gone wrong. Who knows? And if there were more than one person involved, then sure, you can have DNA for one and not the other. So, like with Gary, he may have written the letter because, that's his part in it, but maybe he wasn't the one who actually sexually assaulted her.
So
and it was somebody else. So that's why the DNA excluded him.
Yeah.
So who knows?
We got to think in terms of this. Whoever did this was not a good person who with a strong education and who could probably plot. I highly doubt whoever did this could even plot a simple robbery based on all the stuff left behind, the scuffs on the wall. Was it a kidnapping that went botched? It's very possible that on a team of people, that whomever put them up to doing this, the unfortunate part is one of the people in the team or two were a pedophile, and their urges took the better of them, and it turned more fit. Because initially, you think about this, she had stun gun marks on her body. That's even for a girl, a 6-year-old, that's a little extreme. Like, all right, we got to subdue her with a stun gun in the face and the back. It's pretty,
Well, I've seen that before. So, I mean, and I saw it in a case where the kid was 5 years old, and I'm sure it was to keep him from crying.
Oof.
One of those deals. So I'll tell you another thing, just real quick. I got to throw this out there because sometimes just things pop in my brain, but
Sure.
I would be shocked. Nobody's ever talked about mom or dad's DNA being on the body. I mean, you would think that there should be DNA on the body from number one. John ended up picking her up and brought her upstairs.
Right.
Is his DNA not on the body anywhere? I mean, how is that possible to not have his DNA? That should be an automatic. And really the mom. I mean, moms give daughters baths, or they make sure that they're cleaned up or dressed them, or their clothes. They folded their clothes and put them up in the drawer.
Well,
first.
more importantly,
I would be shocked. I'm more surprised that there's not that DNA from
Right.
the parents on the underwear.
more importantly, it's Christmas, hugging, kissing. The mother seems like a very affectionate person.
Yeah.
And I imagine
second of all,
a lot of hugging and kissing. You're right. Where is that DNA? That's a good point.
I would like to know where that DNA.
Yeah, but I think they were looking at like inside the underwear. So,
Right.
I mean, with my kids, I don't think I would, I fold it,
No,
but I fold
agreed.
the out.
Agreed.
You know what I mean?
Agreed.
So, sorry.
Is that me? Or is that you making that crazy noise? Is that me?
It's
I think
Sandy.
it may-
Yeah, Sandy. She's getting feedback.
It would be me. It would be me.
So,
And then the one thing I want to make a quick point. Let me take a quick point real quick too.
Yep.
I would like to know in reference to the injuries, specifically the injury of she had been sexually assaulted. I'd like to know if they know, was that post-mortem or was that when she was alive? I think that's a big sign as to the profile of the killer potentially. And I would think that they would have been able to determine that based on the exam. I don't know, but I'd like to know the answer to that as to whether or not she was alive or not. So
I'm glad you said that was a question I was going to bring next. I'm like, because if it's post-mortem, the predator that was involved with this just couldn't help himself. Look, all right, she's already dead, but you know what I mean? Like, it's a crazy bit of psychology, especially when you send someone in to do a kidnapping and it gets to the point of violence that the little girl put up a major fight. We don't even know if she was killed in that basement. She could have been brought back. That scuff mark on that wall drove an idea to me. Like they had to, it was made, what is that wall? 4 foot tall, 4.5 feet.
it looks higher to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even if it's like 5 foot, they have to carry her up there here's the better part. This is what makes me somewhat think that there's other people involved. Because let's say the guy, they take her out of the home, things go wrong, and for whatever reason they bring her back to the home. You can't just pick her up. Like, let's say you climb down to the window, you're going to reach back up and pull her and bring her back down, or is she in a suitcase? Either way, there's a handoff involved. And if there wasn't a handoff involved, I think there'd be a little bit more disturbance in the room, right? There's no way one guy pulled her through that window, whether she's in a suitcase or however they transported her body. It doesn't make sense to me that there's only one person involved here. So is it that the kidnapping was botched because the little girl put up a fight and then she died as a result of her fighting back and her screaming, and it's the middle of the night and they want to suppress her screams and she ends up dying? And then, the guy brings her back in the house, and the DNA on the underwear and the leg are pretty well preserved for the most part, at least what I read. Did the sexual assault then happen in the basement? This whole thing, it's a little girl, and despite how long ago it was, despite it being a case, it still troubles me to my core. It's a little girl. You know, and I hate to say this, but people that do this to a little girl should be loaded into a spring and shot into a wall. You know, let's be honest. Because there's no reason to put them in prison to pay for them to live the rest of their life when they've done this to a little girl. Blows me away. So I don't know. That whole scuff mark on the wall, the way the suitcase is placed, which in my mind, the suitcase is placed there for a footstep. And that's how they're transporting her through it in and out of the window. They didn't say in the documentary, and I don't remember hearing from anyone else, but was she killed in the basement and or out of the home? That's the question.
Yeah, I don't think they really know the answer to that definitively.
Yeah, it's troubling. It's really troubling. So, all right, before we sum up here, is there anything anyone wants to add?
Well, I mean, I'm always optimistic. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I think, it is very sad that this has gone on, unsolved. And I'm sure there's a lot of other cases like this. And I do hope that there are still seems like a lot of things that can be done to maybe discover. And I hope that that's actually productive, and maybe finally whoever is, responsible for this is caught. It'd be nice.
Yeah. Jason, anything in summary?
I'm going to echo what she said. I'm very optimistic that just the way science is moving forward in really positive directions with respect to a lot of these cases, I have hope that one day we will get the identity of who this person was. Maybe this is kind of you have a lot of people that are armchair sleuths now. That if you look at the documentary "Don't F with Cats," just how the work that those people did. I'm not inviting that on every one of these cases, but I think that you can't help it. And I think that you have a lot of people that want this case solved. My hope is that one day it will. I think that the courtroom will be a much more challenging aspect for anybody, just due to how the crime scene was kind of just handled in a way that it just opens itself up for all kinds of questions. But, I hope it does. I really do. We don't want somebody like this out there. I think, actually, at the end of the day, I think if this person ever is revealed, we'll probably be going, are you kidding me? This guy was like right there, right in front of us the whole time,
right?
Kind of a deal. And maybe we'll be shocked by who this person may be. Could be one of those type of cases. Who knows? But I hope they do. And hopefully, if nothing else, maybe police officers across the world have learned from this case and bettered themselves to help with their cases.
Agreed. Leslie?
I guess the only thing I would say is I imagine there's so many details that are not revealed openly. So we don't know if they thoroughly investigated and talked to this one person. Did they talk to this guy, or what did they find out? There's so many intentionally kind of held in information that when we go down a rabbit hole trying to figure out a particular method or suspect, we're not sure because we don't have that extra information, if that makes sense. And so hopefully if they really end up connecting with the cold case team from Colorado, if that really takes place, a lot of what we're talking about here will be addressed, and there will be people involved that will look at those things and maybe have a clear path to finding who's responsible.
I hope so. I hope there was, if nothing more, than to let the little girl rest. And, unfortunately, the mother's passed. She had a tremendous amount of stress, but at the end of the day, this father, John, he's putting a lot of resources in the fight. Like I said, these TV networks and they didn't approach him. He's approaching them. He's reaching out. He's keeping it alive. He wants resolve. And my hope is that he gets that resolve. I really hope so. That being said, for those of you that are listening, we're going to say good day, good evening, or good night, whatever it is for you. And I'm going to talk to these guys in post.